I have told this story exactly once before, and the man I told it to did not interrupt me, did not ask questions, and did not move from his chair until I finished, not because he fully believed what I said, but because something in the way I spoke made him feel like leaving the room would have been a mistake. What you are about to hear is not a story and not a rumor, because no one wanted this story to exist, and no one involved ever tried to turn it into something meaningful or dramatic, since meaning requires distance, and distance was the one thing we never managed to create. In 1980, I was one of 3 loggers sent into an old section of forest that had already been approved, surveyed, and signed off as safe, a routine job with no history of incidents, no abnormal reports, and no reason for the official records to later claim that we abandoned the site due to internal conflict. I am speaking now because the other 2 men refused to acknowledge what happened, not even to themselves, and because silence only works when the thing causing it is finished, which in our case, it was not. We did not see the Skugvarg at first, and that matters, because what hunted us did not reveal itself through violence or sound, but through the quiet certainty that our movements were being measured, matched, and slowly corrected. If you are listening to this late, alone, or with the lights low, understand this clearly. I am not here to entertain you. I am here because what followed us out of that forest did not stay there. So do not skip ahead and do not turn this off halfway through, because stories like this only protect you if you hear them in full. And if you want more testimonies that were never meant to surface, subscribe now and stay here, because once I start describing how the Skugvarg made itself known, walking away becomes the worst possible choice. The first thing people misunderstand about that forest is that it did not feel old in the way people imagine when they hear those words, because there were no twisted trees, no unnatural silence, and no sense of trespassing when we arrived, only the steady, almost boring normality of a place that had been logged before, measured before, and deemed profitable enough to return to without ceremony or hesitation. There were 3 of us assigned to that section, all experienced, all familiar with long days and early starts, and none of us the type to dramatize discomfort, which is why the initial details stand out so sharply in my memory now, because they were not frightening details, just slightly incorrect ones that did not demand attention until they began to stack on top of each other. The paths we followed were marked on our maps, yet they never quite matched the ground beneath our boots, not in any dramatic way, but in small offsets, like a turn that came a few steps too late, or a clearing that was wider than expected, forcing us to double-check our bearings, even though the sun was clear and the terrain familiar. We joked about it at first, blaming outdated surveys or seasonal changes, and we worked through the morning with the kind of rhythm that only comes from repetition, the sound of equipment filling the air, the smell of sap and fuel blending together, and the forest accepting us without resistance, which is important to say, because nothing resisted us that day, not even when it should have. It was near midday when one of the men mentioned the sound, and the reason I remember that moment so clearly is because he did not stop working when he said it, did not raise his voice, and did not even look up, which told me immediately that whatever he was hearing did not feel urgent enough to demand action, only strange enough to be acknowledged. He asked if we had noticed how the forest seemed to repeat us, not echoing our noise, but answering it, as if every movement we made had a delayed counterpart deeper in the trees, something too irregular to be wind and too deliberate to be coincidence, though still subtle enough to dismiss if you wanted to keep your focus on the job. I remember standing still for a moment longer than necessary, listening without fully admitting that I was listening, and realizing that when I shifted my weight or adjusted my stance, the forest did not respond immediately, but waited, like it was correcting its timing, learning when to move so that we would not notice the difference between our presence and something else matching it. We finished the day without incident, but we left later than planned, not because of setbacks, but because we kept losing time to small recalculations, checking measurements that should have been final, rewalking short distances that felt wrong underfoot, and arguing mildly over details that none of us could clearly explain, which later became the official explanation for why productivity slowed. As we packed up and began the walk back toward camp, I became aware of the sensation that the forest behind us felt fuller than when we had entered it. Not louder or darker, but occupied in a way that suggested something had taken an interest in the paths we had created and was now testing them quietly, without stepping into view. That night, as we sat near the edge of the cleared area and talked about things unrelated to work, none of us mentioned the sound again, but all three of us positioned ourselves so that we could see the tree line clearly, not because we expected to see anything emerge, but because something in us understood that whatever had begun adjusting itself to us earlier had not stopped simply because we did. The second day began with a mistake so small that I did not recognize it as one until much later, because mistakes usually announce themselves through consequence, and this one announced itself through absence, through the quiet realization that something we expected to find was no longer where it should have been. One of the marked routes we had cleared the previous day was partially obscured, not erased, but softened, as if the forest had settled back into it overnight, pressing debris and low growth into the open line just enough to make it feel less intentional, which we again dismissed as natural recovery, even though the timing made no sense. As we moved deeper into the section, the repetition returned, stronger this time, no longer delayed enough to ignore, but still careful, still restrained, matching our progress without ever overtaking it, like a presence that understood that being seen was unnecessary if being certain was enough. It was then that the second man stopped entirely, placing his hand against a tree not to steady himself, but to feel it, as if checking whether it was real. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a flatness that did not belong in casual conversation, because he said that whatever was moving with us was not circling or approaching, but pacing us, adjusting its distance whenever we slowed or sped up, as if maintaining a boundary we were not meant to cross. We tested that theory without discussing it, accelerating our work, cutting faster, moving between points with deliberate urgency, and the forest answered in kind, the sound shifting closer without becoming clearer, the presence tightening its awareness without revealing form, which was when the word Skugvarg entered the conversation for the first time. The man who said it did not explain where he had heard it or why it fit, only that it described the sensation perfectly, not a wolf and not a shadow, but the idea of a hunter that did not rush, because rushing was unnecessary when the outcome was already decided. From that moment forward, our attention fractured, part of it locked onto our tasks and part of it pulled outward, scanning without focus, listening without direction, until even our own movements felt staged, rehearsed for something that was learning how we behaved when we thought we were alone. We attempted to leave early that afternoon, citing equipment issues over the radio, and although the response acknowledged our request, the signal degraded in a way that made the approval feel theoretical rather than actionable, forcing us to navigate back without guidance, relying on routes that no longer felt stable beneath memory. During that walk, the Skugvarg made its presence known without showing itself, not through sound or movement, but through alignment, because every time we stopped, the forest stopped with us, and every time we resumed, something resumed as well, perfectly synchronized, erasing the last doubt that we were imagining it. By the time we reached camp, the fear was no longer sharp or frantic, but heavy and settled, the kind that convinces you that escape is not about distance, but about whether the thing that has chosen you believes you are finished yet. That night, none of us slept, not because we heard something approaching, but because we were all aware of the same quiet truth, that the Skugvarg had learned our pace, our timing, and our habits, and that learning something that well usually meant it intended to use the knowledge. On the third morning, we made a decision that seemed practical at the time and embarrassingly naive in hindsight, because we decided that if the forest was going to play with our sense of direction, then we would stop trusting the ground and start trusting our own markers, which meant we spent the first hour driving bright tape into trunks, cutting shallow notches into bark, and stacking small cairns of stone at intervals that would have been impossible to miss unless someone had moved them with intent. The work itself should have felt reassuring, because nothing calms a crew like visible order and repeated procedure. Yet the moment we began laying that order down, I felt something tighten around us, not in the air, not in the sound, but in the way the trees seemed to hold their distance like a crowd, stepping back to let something important pass through the middle. And I remember thinking that the forest was not reacting to our fear, but to our certainty, as if certainty was the only thing that offended it. We pushed deeper than we had the previous 2 days, partly to prove to ourselves that we could, and partly because the schedule demanded it, and because in those days, pride lived in small acts, like refusing to let a place rewrite your plan, even when the plan was only to cut and haul and go home. Which is why it took us longer than it should have to admit that the route ahead did not behave like a route should, because the tape we had just tied showed up again in the wrong places, not far away, not after hours of travel, but within minutes, as if we were walking in a circle that our own hands had drawn while we were still walking forward. One of the men laughed in a way that sounded forced and dry, and he said we were tired and turning ourselves around without noticing. But the third man, the quiet one, did not laugh at all, because he walked straight to one of the taped trunks and ran his fingers over the knot, like he expected it to be warm. And then he looked at me with a face that had already decided something, and he said that if we had not tied that tape twice, then it meant something else had. We should have left at that point, and I understand what it looks like when I say that out loud, because it sounds like the kind of statement people make to strengthen a story after the fact. Yet I remember the exact moment my stomach dropped, not from fear of being attacked, but from the sudden feeling that we were being managed, which is a different kind of terror entirely, because it does not give you a target, it gives you a system, and systems do not need to show themselves to keep working. We tried to test it again, because men will test what they cannot accept. So we split for a short distance while staying within shouting range, each of us taking a different line and then returning to the same clearing. And while the plan was supposed to prove that the forest could not duplicate our markers across separate paths, what it proved instead was that separation made everything worse, because while I was alone for those few minutes, I became aware of a second set of footsteps that were not behind me, not beside me, but timed to mine in such perfect delay that the sound felt like my own movement being played back by something with better patience than I had. When I stopped, the footsteps stopped, and when I started again, they started again, and when I turned my head quickly, expecting to catch movement, I saw only trees and the shifting pattern of light and shade, yet the certainty of the match stayed in my bones, and I understood in that moment why men swear they are hunted, even when there is no visible hunter, because being hunted is not always about teeth and impact. Sometimes it is about the moment you realize your behavior has been observed long enough to be predicted. We regrouped without speaking much, and we walked back toward camp using our markers like a lifeline. Yet the lifeline kept reappearing where it should not have been, and by late afternoon our irritation had turned into something flatter and colder, something like resignation, because we were no longer debating whether the Skugvarg was real. We were debating what it wanted from us, which is always the worst question, because it implies that you are already in a relationship with it. That evening we found our equipment moved, not stolen and not destroyed, simply repositioned by a few feet, as if someone had touched it with careful hands, and the quiet one said, almost conversationally, that wolves do not move objects like that. But something that understands the value of human routine does, and even though none of us argued with him, I saw the shift in our faces, because the hunt had stopped feeling like wilderness and started feeling like intelligence. The fourth day was the day we stopped pretending that leaving was a simple matter of walking out, because the moment we woke, we found proof that something had come close enough in the night to study how we slept, and it had done so without waking us, which meant it either moved with impossible silence, or it had no need to avoid noise, because it had already learned what noise would and would not pull us from our beds. Outside the edge of camp, where the ground was soft and mottled with needles and old leaves, we saw the impressions first, not paw prints in the way people expect, but depressions that suggested weight distributed oddly, as if something had knelt or crouched for a long time in one place. And beside those depressions there were long drag marks that looked almost deliberate, like someone had drawn lines through the debris with the tips of their fingers simply to leave evidence behind. And I remember the sickening calm that followed, because once something leaves evidence on purpose, it is no longer hiding from you. It is training you. We made a plan that morning to exit by midday no matter what, and we agreed we would stay close together, keep the radio on constantly, and carry what mattered while leaving the rest, because in that moment, the job ceased to exist, and all that remained was the need to return to a place with roads and other people and normal sound. Yet even as we spoke, I could feel the forest listening, not as a metaphor, but as a physical fact, because the birds did not move away, and the wind did not pick up, and the stillness held like a held breath. The first sign that the forest would not allow a clean departure came when the radio began to behave like it was being interrupted by something patient, because the static did not rise and fall randomly. It rose when we spoke and eased when we went quiet, as if something was pressing its presence against the channel only when we tried to send our voices out. And the quiet one, who had barely slept, said that it felt like the Skugvarg did not care if we communicated with each other, only that we should not communicate with anyone beyond the trees. We started walking anyway, carrying what we could, and the route out should have been familiar by then. Yet within the first quarter hour, the ground began to tilt our expectations sideways, because every landmark we relied on seemed shifted, not enough to notice at a glance, but enough to make our confidence leak away, which is exactly how you trap competent men, because you do not need to terrify them. You only need to make them doubt the simplest facts, like how far they have walked and how long a straight line should remain straight. We reached a small stream that had not been on our map, and I know how that sounds, because streams do not appear overnight, but this one was there, cutting across our path with water that moved too slowly, and as we stood on the bank deciding how to cross it, the repetition returned stronger than ever. Except now it was not simply matching our movements, it was shaping them, because when one of us stepped forward, the feeling of pressure behind the tree line increased, and when we stepped back, the pressure eased, as if the Skugvarg was not following but herding, allowing us certain choices while discouraging others. The quiet one suddenly raised his hand and told us to stop, and when we froze, he pointed into the trees without fully extending his arm, like he was afraid a direct gesture would be noticed, and he said he could see a darkness that was not shadow, a long vertical absence between trunks, and even though my eyes struggled to isolate it, I felt my body react before my mind confirmed anything, because the part of you that survives knows shape in a way that eyesight cannot explain. We did not run, because running would have been an admission that it could dictate our pace, and instead, we walked, slow and controlled, trying to keep our breathing quiet. Yet the entire time the sensation stayed with us, that we were being watched from a distance that was intentionally chosen, never close enough to be clear, never far enough to be safe. And that, more than anything, is why men swear they were hunted, because the hunt is not always a chase. Sometimes it is the steady arrangement of your options until only one remains. By late afternoon, we found ourselves back near the original work site without meaning to, and we stood there staring at our own cut lines and our own tape and our own footprints like we had stumbled into a memory. And in that moment, the quiet one finally said what none of us wanted to say, which was that the Skugvarg was not keeping us in because it wanted to kill us quickly. It was keeping us in because it wanted to learn us completely before it decided what we were for. By the fifth day, the forest no longer felt like a place we were trapped inside, because the idea of being trapped still implies that escape is possible if you find the right opening, and what we were dealing with had begun to feel less like a barrier and more like a decision being enforced, as though some boundary had been drawn around us that was not made of trees or distance, but of permission, and we did not have it. We woke to a silence that was not empty but controlled, because the wind should have moved through the canopy at least a little, and birds should have returned with the light. yet everything remained still in a way that made the air feel thick, as if the forest itself was holding its breath to listen more closely. And I remember how the quiet one looked at the tree line for a long time before speaking, because he had the expression of a man reading something written too faintly to be sure. And when he finally turned back to us, he said that whatever had been pacing us before had changed its method. He told us he did not think it was moving with us anymore, not in the way it had. And when I asked what he meant, he answered with a sentence that made my skin crawl, because he said it did not need to match our steps now, since it had already learned them, and instead it was waiting at the points it knew we would reach, which meant that our sense of being followed was actually the opposite, that we were walking towards something that had already arrived. We decided to move anyway, because staying in camp felt worse than taking action, and because our supplies were thinning, and because people do not remain rational when they feel watched for too long. So they begin to look for anything that resembles control, even if that control is just choosing a direction and committing to it. Our plan was simple, which is always a bad sign in a situation like this, because simple plans depend on the world cooperating, and the world was no longer cooperating with us. Yet we packed what we could carry and chose a heading we believed would lead us out within a few hours, and we promised each other we would not split, not even for a moment, because the fifth day had taught us that separation was not just dangerous, it was useful to whatever was managing us. We walked in a tight line, close enough to touch shoulders if needed, and for the first hour nothing happened, which only increased the tension because we had learned that absence was often the beginning of something. And as the light shifted through the branches, I noticed a new detail that I had not seen before, a pattern in the forest floor where the debris was disturbed in long, shallow arcs, like something heavy had been dragged repeatedly in the same curved path, not randomly, not as if it had fallen, but as if it had been moved on purpose to create a shape. The quiet one saw it too, and he crouched without fully turning his back to the trees, and he ran his hand a few inches above the marks without touching them, as if he expected the ground to be contaminated by intent. And he said that this was the first time the Skugvarg had left us a sign that was meant to be understood, because those arcs were not tracks and not scratches. They were a boundary, a message drawn where we would be forced to notice it. We crossed that boundary anyway, and the moment our last boot stepped over the line, the forest changed, not through sound, not through movement, but through attention, because I felt the pressure of being watched intensify so suddenly that it was like stepping into a room filled with people and realizing every face had turned toward you at once. The second man began breathing faster, and he tried to hide it by speaking, asking questions about the map, about our heading, about the distance to the road, and I answered him with reassurances I did not believe, because my own mind had begun to do something strange, something that frightened me more than the idea of teeth, because my thoughts kept returning to the same image, a tall darkness between trees, not moving, not charging, simply waiting in a posture that suggested patience. And the more I tried to force my attention forward, the more that image held like a hook. Then came the first sound that was undeniably not ours, and it was not a howl, which would have been almost comforting, because howls belong to wolves and wolves belong to the world we understand. But this sound was a low, measured exhale, too deep and too controlled to be animal breath, and it came from ahead of us, from the place we had been walking toward with such determination, which meant the quiet one had been right, and it had been waiting. We stopped without speaking, and in the silence that followed, I realized the exhale had done its work, because it had proven something that removed hope, which was that the Skugvarg did not need to chase us, since it could position itself before us whenever it chose. And that realization, more than anything, is what makes men swear they were hunted, because it is the moment you understand that escape is no longer a matter of speed. We should have turned back immediately, but turning back would have meant returning to the boundary we had already crossed. And something in my body warned me that crossing back over it would be the same as admitting defeat. And in places like that, admitting defeat feels less like surrender and more like permission being granted, So we held our ground and tried to listen in a way that did not look like listening. The forest ahead remained still for a long time, long enough that part of my mind began searching for a rational explanation, because the human brain will cling to any alternative to terror. Yet the longer we stood, the more obvious it became that the stillness was active, not passive, like an animal freezing when it wants you to move first, not because it is afraid, but because it is curious how you will behave when you realize you are being tested. The second man whispered that he could smell something, and when I asked him what he meant, he said it was like wet iron and old fur, like a trapline cabin that had been shut for years and then opened suddenly. And the moment he said it, I smelled it too. Not strong, not overpowering, but present enough to confirm that our senses were not inventing the same detail by coincidence. We began moving again, because staying still made us feel like prey, and we moved slowly, stepping carefully, trying to keep our sound minimal. Yet I understood even then that sound did not matter, because whatever was waiting for us did not need to locate us by noise, since it already knew our position simply by the fact that we existed inside its chosen space. As we walked, the smell grew slightly stronger, and the light began to dim earlier than it should have, not because the sun was setting, but because the canopy thickened in a way that felt purposeful, funneling us into a corridor of darker trunks where the ground dipped and rose irregularly. And in that corridor, the repetition returned for the last time. Except now, it was not behind us and not beside us. It was ahead, because we began hearing our own footfalls in front of our footsteps, like an imitation that had moved into position to guide us by copying us. The quiet one stopped suddenly and raised his hand again, and when we froze, he turned his head slightly toward me and said, very softly, that the Skugvarg was doing something new, because it was no longer hiding its intelligence, it was demonstrating it. And he said that if we continued forward, we would reach whatever it wanted us to reach. I asked him what he thought it wanted, and he did not answer immediately, because he was listening to something I could not yet isolate. And then he said that he thought it wanted proof of how far we would go before we broke, proof of which one of us would make the first wrong choice, proof of who would run and who would freeze, and who would try to negotiate with a thing that could not be reasoned with. In that moment, as if responding to the word proof, we saw something that changed the entire shape of the story, because the corridor opened into a small clearing, and in that clearing, there was an object that did not belong in any forest, an object that could not have been carried there by accident, and it was placed in the center, with a kind of careful symmetry that made my stomach twist. It was one of our own hard hats, the red one the second man always wore, and it was clean, unnaturally clean, as if it had been washed, and beside it was a line of our own bright tape, laid out straight on the ground like a ruler, and beyond that line, just at the edge of the clearing where the shadows deepened, there was a long indentation in the debris that looked like a body had been dragged into the trees and then pulled back out again, not to show violence, but to show possibility. The second man whispered that he had not lost his hard hat, and he stepped forward without meaning to, as if the sight of something familiar had overridden his fear, and I reached for him instinctively, but the quiet one grabbed my wrist and held me back with a grip that hurt, and he said, through clenched teeth, that this was not an accident and not a mistake, that it was a demonstration, and that the Skugvarg was teaching us that it could take what belonged to us and return it whenever it wanted, in whatever condition it chose. We stood there staring at that clean hard hat like it was a confession, and as we stared, the smell of wet iron and old fur thickened, and from the tree line came that same low exhale again, closer now, followed by a sound that was almost a laugh, not human laughter, not animal chatter, but a dry, controlled vibration, like something testing how far it could imitate emotion without needing to feel it. That was the moment I understood what the Skugvarg truly was. Not a wolf, not a shadow, but a hunter that had studied us long enough to know that the fastest way to break a man is not to attack him, but to show him that his world can be rearranged with calm hands, and that he has no say in how it is done. The seventh day began with the Quiet One making a decision that none of us argued with, not because we agreed with it, but because arguing would have meant admitting that we still believed debate mattered. And by then, debate felt like a luxury for people whose options had not already been arranged for them. He said we were going to stop trying to leave in the way the forest expected us to try. And when I asked him what that meant, he answered that the Skugvarg had been shaping our choices by predicting our habits, which meant the only way to interrupt the pattern was to behave in a way that did not align with survival instinct, routine, or logic, because those were the things it understood best. His plan was simple and terrifying, because simplicity had taken on a different meaning in that place, and he said we were going to return to the clearing with the hard hat, not to retrieve it, not to investigate it, but to acknowledge it, because predators that demonstrate control do so to provoke response, and denying that response was the only move we had not yet made. We walked back toward the clearing in silence, and the forest allowed it, which was its own warning, because resistance had always been the sign that we were stepping outside the lines drawn for us. Yet this time, the path opened smoothly, the ground cooperating under our boots, the light remaining stable, as if we were finally doing exactly what we were meant to do. When the clearing came into view, the hard hat was gone, and the tape was gone, and in their place there was something worse, because absence carries intent just as clearly as presence when you understand what you are dealing with. And the Quiet One stopped at the edge and said that this meant the Skugvarg had accepted the acknowledgement and moved to the next stage. The second man began to shake then, not violently, but in a way that suggested his body had begun reacting ahead of his thoughts. And he whispered that he could hear breathing again, closer than before, and this time I heard it too. Not ahead of us and not behind us, but to the side, deep in the trees, where the light barely reached, and the rhythm of it felt wrong, too slow for exertion, too measured for hunger. The Quiet One stepped forward into the clearing alone, and when I reached out to stop him, he turned and looked at me with a calm that frightened me more than panic ever could, because calm in a place like that means acceptance has already happened. And he said that the Skugvarg needed one of us to step out of formation to confirm what it had already inferred, which was that we would eventually sacrifice structure to preserve ourselves. He did not run, and he did not call out, and he did not brandish anything. He simply walked to the center of the clearing and stopped, standing still with his hands at his sides like a man waiting for instructions. And in that stillness, the forest responded immediately, because the pressure we had felt for days shifted all at once, tightening around him and easing around us, like a hand adjusting its grip. What followed was not a reveal, not a dramatic emergence, but a distortion of attention, because the space behind the trees began to feel deeper than it should have been, like the distance between trunks was expanding without movement, and in that expansion, there was a shape that did not advance but resolved, becoming clearer not by stepping forward, but by allowing the light to acknowledge it. I will not describe it in full, because description implies clarity, and clarity was never offered, but I will say that it stood upright and tall, and that its outline suggested a wolf only in the way a shadow suggests a body, by implication rather than detail, and that its head was angled in a way that felt observant rather than aggressive, as if it was studying posture, breath, and intention, rather than preparing to strike. The Quiet One spoke then, and his voice did not shake, which felt like the final test, because he said that we understood now, that we knew the forest was not ours and never had been, and that we were willing to leave without taking anything more, without cutting anything more, without marking anything more. And as he spoke, the shape tilted its head slightly, not in curiosity, but in confirmation, like a thing checking off a condition. There was a long moment where nothing happened, and then the pressure lifted just enough to be noticeable, and the Quiet One took a step back toward us without turning his back. And when he reached our line, the shape did not follow, but it did not retreat either. And in that balance, I realized something crucial, which was that the Skugvarg had never intended to kill us, because killing would have ended the interaction, and what it wanted was understanding, not blood. When we backed away from the clearing together, moving slowly, maintaining formation, the forest allowed it again, and the breathing faded, and the shape dissolved back into depth, and I understood then that we had passed something without winning it, and that whatever rules governed that place had been satisfied temporarily, not permanently. That night we slept in short, shallow bursts, not because we felt safe, but because exhaustion had finally outweighed vigilance, and in my dreams I kept seeing the clearing empty again and again, over and over, until I woke with the certainty that emptiness was the most deliberate message the Skugvarg could leave behind. The 8th day was the first day the forest gave something back without taking something in return, which should have felt like relief, yet instead it filled me with dread, because gifts from a hunter are never free. They are signals that a phase has ended and another has begun. We woke to sound, real sound, birds moving, leaves shifting, wind threading through branches, and for a moment it felt like the world had returned to its proper scale, like the forest had released us from a held position and resumed its own rhythms. Yet the Quiet One did not share that relief, and he said that normality was not proof of safety, it was proof that attention had shifted elsewhere. We packed quickly and moved out at first light, following a route that should have intersected with the old access road by mid-morning, and for the first time since we had arrived the landmarks behaved the way they were supposed to, appearing where memory placed them and receding behind us without repetition, and I felt hope rise in me cautiously, like a hand lifting toward a surface it expects to burn. As the day went on, the second man began talking again, filling the air with small observations and half-jokes, and I let myself believe that maybe the Skugvarg had been territorial rather than predatory, that maybe it had simply wanted us gone and had achieved that goal. Yet even as those thoughts formed, there was a weight in my chest that did not lift, because something fundamental had changed in the way I understood movement and silence. It was near midday when we reached the road, and seeing it felt unreal, like stepping into a photograph, because the straight line of gravel and the open sky beyond it represented a world that did not negotiate with shadows, and we stepped onto it together without speaking, all three of us standing there, as if waiting for something to stop us. Nothing did. We walked down the road for nearly an hour before any of us spoke, and when we did it was about ordinary things, about food and rest and how we would explain the delay, and I noticed how carefully we avoided mentioning the forest, as if naming it would reopen a door we had barely managed to close. When we reached the truck, the second man laughed for the first time in days, and the sound startled all of us, because it felt foreign in our own mouths. And as we drove away, I watched the tree line recede in the mirror until it blended back into the distance, and I told myself that this was the end of it, that survival had been enough. It was not until weeks later, after we had returned to separate lives and separate routines, that I began to understand what the 8th day had actually been for, because the habits the Skugvarg had learned did not disappear when we left the forest. They came with us, woven into the way we moved through quiet spaces and the way we reacted to stillness. I noticed it first when I began waking just before dawn, with the sensation of being observed, not watched in the sense of eyes on skin, but watched in the sense of pattern recognition, like something had learned my breathing again and was checking to see if it still matched. The second man stopped answering my calls entirely, and months later I heard he had sold his house and moved closer to town without explanation, and the Quiet One sent me a single letter that contained no details at all, only a line that said some hunts do not end when the forest does. They end when the hunter decides it knows enough. I do not believe the Skugvarg followed us in the way people imagine predators following prey, through tracks and distance and physical pursuit. But I do believe it learned us thoroughly enough to recognize us anywhere, and that recognition is not bound to trees or wilderness. It is bound to behavior. That is why I am telling you this now, not because I expect you to believe every word, but because patterns only remain invisible when no one compares them. And if you have ever felt a presence in a place that should have been empty, or noticed repetition, where there should have been randomness, then you already understand more than you think. The Skugvarg does not need the forest anymore, because once it understands how you move when you think you are alone, the forest becomes optional. And that realization, more than anything else, is why 3 loggers swore they were hunted in 1980, even after they made it out alive. The 9th part of this story is the one most people wish I would skip, not because it contains the most frightening moment, but because it removes the last comfortable illusion, which is that survival means resolution, and that once you escape a place, the rules of that place no longer apply to you. For a long time after we left the forest, I convinced myself that what lingered was psychological, that prolonged stress had trained my body to overreact to quiet and repetition, and that with enough routine and enough noise, the sensations would fade. Yet what actually happened was the opposite, because the more normal my life became, the more obvious the deviations grew. It started subtly, in ways that would sound ridiculous if I described them as isolated incidents, which is exactly why I did not describe them at all for months, because I began noticing that my movements were being matched again, not by sound or sight, but by timing, as if something had learned when I would pause in a hallway, when I would slow before turning a corner, and when I would stop just short of a doorway without consciously deciding to do so. I noticed it at work first, when I began arriving at places a few seconds later than expected without knowing why, only to find that conversations had shifted or ended just before I arrived. And I noticed it at home when I would wake moments before my alarm repeatedly, my breathing already shallow, my body already prepared, as if something else had set the schedule before I had. The most unsettling part was that nothing ever escalated, because escalation would have allowed me to name it as fear, and fear would have given me something to fight. Yet what I experienced was adjustment, a gradual reshaping of my habits so subtle that I could not point to a moment where it began, only to the realization that my behavior no longer felt entirely self-directed. I spoke to the quiet one only once after that, and when I did, he did not deny any of it, which frightened me more than disbelief would have, because he said that the Skugvarg was not interested in us anymore as individuals, but as examples, and that once something understands how a person responds to uncertainty, it does not need to remain close, because distance does not erase learning. He said that hunters like that do not follow bodies, they follow patterns, and patterns travel easily, slipping into cities and routines and crowds without resistance, because no one thinks to guard against being understood too well. Not long after that conversation, the second man vanished from my life entirely, not dramatically and not tragically, just quietly, like someone stepping out of alignment with everyone who knew him. And when I tried to trace him through old contacts, I found that he had erased himself with surprising thoroughness, as if disappearance had become a practiced skill rather than a desperate act. That was when I began to suspect that what we had mistaken for mercy in the forest had actually been evaluation, and that being allowed to leave had been contingent on something we did not understand at the time, which was that the Skugvarg had learned enough to no longer require proximity. I began documenting everything then, not out of paranoia, but out of discipline, writing down times and sensations and small behavioral changes. And what frightened me most was how often the notes described anticipation rather than reaction, because anticipation implies expectation, and expectation implies an observer who has seen the sequence before. The 9th chapter of this story is not about being hunted in the traditional sense, because there were no teeth and no chase and no final confrontation. It is about realizing that the hunt had shifted form, and that once something understands you deeply enough, it no longer needs to pursue you actively, because you will continue the pattern on its behalf. The 10th and final part is the one I delayed the longest, because endings suggest closure, and there is nothing closed about what happened to us, only paused, like a breath being held indefinitely while waiting to see if you notice. Years have passed since 1980, and I have lived a life that looks ordinary from the outside, with work and obligations and routines that would not raise concern. Yet beneath that surface there has always been the awareness that my movements are not entirely private, Not because something is watching me constantly, but because something understands me well enough to predict me when it chooses to. I stopped going into deep forests entirely, not out of fear, but out of respect, because fear assumes confrontation, and I no longer believe confrontation is necessary. And I noticed that even in cities I avoid certain spaces instinctively, places where sound behaves strangely, or where patterns repeat too cleanly, because those are the environments where attention feels easiest to apply. I have never seen the Skugvarg again in any physical sense, and I do not believe I ever will, because seeing is not how it operates once learning is complete. And that is the hardest thing to explain to people who want proof, because proof assumes visibility, and the Skugvarg exists most effectively when it remains implied. What matters is not whether it is real in the way animals are real, but whether the effect it has is consistent, because consistency is the signature of intelligence. And what we encountered was nothing if not consistent in the way it adapted, tested, and withdrew once its objective was met. When people ask why I am telling this now, decades later, I tell them that patterns repeat more easily when no one names them, and that silence is not protection, it is permission, because the only thing more useful to a hunter than fear is ignorance. I believe the Skugvarg still exists, not necessarily as a single entity, but as a category of intelligence that emerges where isolation, patience, and observation intersect. And I believe that forests were only its training ground, not its limitation. If you have ever felt watched in a place where no one should have been watching, or noticed your own habits tightening as if something else had begun relying on them, then you already understand why 3 loggers swore they were hunted, even after they returned to safety. This is not a warning meant to frighten you, and it is not a story meant to entertain you casually. It is a reminder that attention moves both ways, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing is not being followed, but being understood. If this story unsettled you, do not dismiss that feeling too quickly, because discomfort is often the first sign that something familiar has been recontextualized. And if you want to continue exploring stories that sit in that uncomfortable space between explanation and implication, then subscribe and stay here. Not because these stories will make you feel safe, but because they will teach you what to notice. And noticing is sometimes the only advantage left. Leave a comment if anything in this story felt familiar, not in detail, but in sensation. And if you have experienced repetition where there should have been randomness, because patterns only stay invisible when people assume they are alone in seeing them. And remember this as you go back to your normal routines. The forest is not the only place where something can learn you. And once something has learned you well enough, distance stops meaning very much at all.